Picture this. A courtroom packed with tension, the weight of authority pressing down on everyone present. The judge's bench looms high above, a symbol of power that has remained untouchable for centuries. But in one explosive moment, everything changed. What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a moment that shattered every expectation of how power works, how justice operates, and what happens when someone refuses to bow down. It started with a slap. Not just any slap, but one that echoed through a courtroom like a gunshot, silencing every whisper, every shuffled paper, every nervous cough. The sound that would become the catalyst for something extraordinary. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. It's not about the violence itself. It's about what happened next. Because sometimes in the face of the most brutal injustice, something inside a person breaks, not in defeat, but in defiance. The woman standing before those officers had no idea she was about to become a symbol. She didn't walk into that courtroom planning to make history. She was there for reasons that had brought her into the cold, unforgiving machinery of the justice system. A system that had never been designed with someone like her in mind. But fate has a way of choosing its messengers, and on this day, in this moment, she was chosen. Who was she? That's the question everyone asked afterward, as if her identity could somehow explain the impossible courage that would follow. Her name doesn't matter as much as what she represented. A woman who had faced adversity before, who understood struggle intimately, who carried herself with a dignity that no courtroom could diminish. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't famous. She wasn't connected to power in any traditional sense. She was exactly the kind of person the system was designed to intimidate, to silence, to control. Her life had taught her lessons that no law school curriculum could provide. She knew what it meant to fight for respect in a world that questioned her worth. She understood the weight of being judged before she ever opened her mouth. Every interaction with authority had been a test of her composure, her intelligence, her right to exist in spaces where people like her were barely tolerated. But these experiences hadn't broken her. They had forged her into something stronger. The morning she walked into that courtroom, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Her shoulders were straight, her gaze direct, her presence undeniable. She didn't know that within hours, her response to injustice would become legendary. She didn't know that her name would be whispered in reverence and spoken with awe. She simply knew that she deserved the same respect as anyone else who entered those hallowed halls of justice. Now, let me paint you the scene of that courtroom, because the atmosphere was everything. The moment you stepped inside, you could feel it. The suffocating weight of institutional power. The ceiling stretched high above, designed to make everyone below feel small, insignificant, powerless. The walls were lined with portraits of judges from decades past, their stern faces seeming to watch and judge every person who dared enter their domain. The officers stood like sentries, their uniforms pressed, their expressions stone cold, their hands never far from their weapons. They weren't just law enforcement in that moment. They were the physical manifestation of a system that maintained order through intimidation. Their very presence sent a clear message. Step out of line and face the consequences. The lawyers shuffled their papers with practiced indifference, discussing lives and futures as if they were nothing more than case numbers and billable hours. The gallery was filled with people who had learned to sit quietly, to speak only when spoken to accept whatever verdict was handed down from on high. This was a place where voices were silenced, where dignity was checked at the door, where justice was a privilege reserved for those who could afford it or were born into it. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of countless dreams deferred, countless lives disrupted, countless moments when the scales of justice had tipped away from fairness. But there was something else in that courtroom that day, a tension that went beyond the usual proceedings. Maybe it was the way the light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Maybe it was a particular mix of people present, each carrying their own stories of struggle and survival. Or maybe it was simply that destiny had chosen this moment, this place, this woman, to make a statement that would echo far beyond those walls. The officers moved with the confidence of men who had never been challenged, never been questioned, never been held accountable for their actions. They were used to compliance, used to fear, used to the immediate submission that their authority typically commanded. They had no reason to expect that this day would be any different from the thousands that had come before it. Then came the confrontation, that moment when authority met defiance head-on. The details of what led to that explosive instant are less important than what it represented. Perhaps it was a word spoken out of turn, a gesture of disrespect, a failure to show the proper deference that the system demanded. Whatever the trigger, the response was swift and brutal. The slap rang out like a judge's gavel, but instead of calling for order, it shattered every pretense of justice in that room. It wasn't just skin meeting skin. It was the sound of power asserting itself through violence, of authority choosing brutality over dignity, of a system revealing its true nature when challenged. The force of it sent shockwaves through everyone present, but not for the reasons you might expect. In that moment, something shifted. The woman who had been struck didn't crumble. She didn't cower. She didn't break. Instead, something extraordinary happened. She stood taller. Her eyes, which should have filled with tears of humiliation, blazed with something far more powerful. The officers who had expected immediate submission found themselves facing something they had never encountered: absolute fearlessness in the face of their authority. The crowd gasped, but it wasn't just shock at the violence. It was recognition of something profound happening before their eyes. This wasn't just another case of authority abusing power. This was the moment when someone decided that enough was enough, that dignity was worth more than safety, that some lines should never be crossed, even by those who believe themselves untouchable. What followed was perhaps the most powerful form of silence ever witnessed in that courtroom. Not the silence of submission, but the silence of someone gathering their strength, someone making a decision that would change everything. The officers, lawyers, and spectators all held their breath, sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't need to. Her presence in that moment said everything that needed to be said. She had been struck down, but she would not stay down. She had been humiliated, but she would not be diminished. She had been violated, but she would not be broken. And in the seconds that followed, everyone in that courtroom began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The woman's response defied every expectation, every script that such moments usually follow. Instead of seeking help, instead of crying out for justice, instead of accepting the role of victim that had been thrust upon her, she began to move, not away from the source of her pain, but towards something that would soon become the most powerful symbol imaginable. Her first step was hesitant, not from fear, but from a magnitude of what she was about to do. Her second step was stronger, more determined. By her third step, everyone in that courtroom realized they were witnessing something that had never happened before and might never happen again. She was walking toward the judge's bench, toward the highest seat of authority in that room, toward a symbol of power that had never been challenged in such a direct, undeniable way. The officers who had struck her found themselves paralyzed by the sheer audacity of what they were witnessing. They had been trained to handle resistance, rebellion, even violence. But they had never been trained for this. For someone who responded to their authority not with fear or anger, but with a quiet determination that made their power seem suddenly impossibly small. With each step she took, the power dynamics in that room shifted dramatically. The judge's bench, which had seemed so high, so imposing, so unreachable just moments before, was now within her grasp. The officers who had appeared so commanding, so in control, so untouchable, were now the ones who seemed uncertain, unsure of how to respond to something that challenged every assumption they had ever made about authority and submission. The gasps from the gallery weren't just sound of surprise. They were the collective intake of breath from people who were watching history unfold before their eyes. Some tried to look away, as if what they were seeing was too powerful, too revolutionary, too dangerous to witness. Others leaned forward, unable to tear their gaze away from this unprecedented display of courage in the face of institutional power. And then it happened, the moment that will be talked about for generations, analyzed by scholars, remembered by anyone who believes in the power of individual courage to challenge systemic injustice. She reached the judge's bench, that towering symbol of authority, that elevated seat of power, that throne of justice that had remained untouchable for countless years. Without hesitation, without ceremony, without asking permission from anyone, she climbed up to that seat. The sound of her movement, the rustle of fabric, the creak of old wood, the whisper of her breathing, seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence that had fallen over the courtroom. Every eye was on her. Every breath was held. Every heartbeat seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. As she settled into the judge's chair, something magical happened. The seat that seemed so large, so imposing when occupied by the traditional holders of judicial power, seemed to fit her perfectly. She didn't look out of place. She looked like she belonged there. Her posture was regal, her expression serene, her presence commanding in a way that had nothing to do with the trappings of office and everything to do with the strength of her character. From that elevated position, she looked out over the courtroom with eyes that had seen too much injustice to be intimidated by its symbols. The officers who had struck her now seemed small from her new vantage point. The lawyers who had ignored her dignity were forced to crane their necks to meet her gaze. The system that had dismissed her worth was now compelled to acknowledge her power. The symbolism was overwhelming and undeniable. Here was a woman whose society had tried to silence, sitting in the seat reserved for those who spoke with the voice of justice. Here was someone who had been denied dignity, occupying a position that was supposed to defend it. Here was a person who had been marginalized, claiming the space at the very center of the legal system. But the true power of the moment wasn't just in the visual. It was in the response it generated. The officers, those men who had been so quick to use violence, found themselves frozen, not by fear exactly, but by the sudden realization that they were facing something they had never encountered before. This wasn't rebellion in any form they recognized. It was transformation. The lawyers stopped shuffling their papers. The spectators stopped their whispered conversations. Even the court reporter's fingers hesitated over the keys, as if uncertain whether this moment could or should be captured in the official record. The entire machinery of the justice system had ground to a halt, not because of violence or chaos, but because one woman had claimed her rightful place in a space that had never been designed for someone like her. The silence stretched on, pregnant with possibilities and heavy with the weight of historical significance. No one moved to remove her from the seat, not because they couldn't, but because something about her presence there felt so right, so necessary, so long overdue that even those in power seemed to recognize the justice of the moment. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time seemed suspended in that courtroom. She sat with the grace of someone born to the position, with the dignity of someone who had earned the right to be there through struggle and suffering and an unbreakable commitment to her own worth. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything that needed to be said about justice, about power, about the right of every human being to be treated with respect and dignity. The confusion among the officers and court officials was palpable. They looked at each other with expressions that asked the same unspoken question: what do we do now? Their training had prepared them for many scenarios, but not for this. Not for someone who responded to injustice not with the expected reactions of fear or anger or submission, but with a quiet claim to dignity that was impossible to deny or ignore. Some of the spectators began to understand that they were witnessing something historic. This wasn't just a disruption of court proceedings. It was a disruption of the entire social order that had kept people like her in their assigned places for far too long. This was a moment when invisible barriers that separated the powerful from the powerless became visible, and then crumbled under the weight of one woman's refusal to accept her assigned role. The psychological shift in the room was tremendous. The officers who had seemed so commanding just minutes before now appeared uncertain, almost childlike in their confusion. The lawyers who had projected such confidence in their mastery of the system now looked lost, unable to find a precedent or procedure that would tell them how to handle this unprecedented situation. And through it all, she sat with perfect composure, as if this was exactly where she was meant to be, exactly what was supposed to happen, exactly the moment that history had been building toward. Her calm was more powerful than any storm, her silence more eloquent than any speech, her presence more commanding than any uniform or badge or title. But this moment was about so much more than one woman claiming one seat in one courtroom. This was about the broader questions that had been simmering in society for generations. Questions about who deserves respect, who has a right to dignity, who gets to occupy positions of power and authority. Her act of defiance had torn away the veil that usually concealed these questions, forcing everyone present to confront them directly. The racial dynamics of the moment were impossible to ignore. Here was a black woman, someone from a group that had been systematically excluded from power for centuries, sitting in the highest seat in the room. The symbolism was staggering, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had ever been denied their rightful place, everyone who had ever been struck down by those who claimed authority over their lives. Her presence in that chair challenged every assumption about worthiness, about qualification, about who deserves to hold power and who deserves to be subject to it. She hadn't been elected to that position, hadn't been appointed by any official body, hadn't earned it through the traditional channels of legal education and political connection. But in that moment, she possessed something more valuable than any credential, the moral authority that comes from having been wronged and choosing to respond with dignity rather than destruction. The officers began to realize that they were facing something unprecedented in their experience. Someone who had been granted power not by any institution, but by the sheer force of their character and the righteousness of their cause. They could have removed her by force, but something held them back. Maybe it was a recognition that doing so would only compound the injustice they had already committed. Maybe it was a growing awareness that they were already on the wrong side of history and didn't want to dig themselves deeper into that hole. The audience in the gallery began to stir, not with unrest, but with a kind of electric energy that comes from witnessing a moment when the impossible becomes possible. Some wept openly, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of seeing someone claim the dignity that had been denied to them for so long. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, every individual who had been told they didn't matter, every human being who had been denied their fundamental right to respect and dignity. Her act had become a mirror in which everyone present could see their own struggles, their own dreams, their own longing for justice. As the minutes ticked by, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in that courtroom. The traditional power structures hadn't just been challenged. They had been revealed as far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The authority of the officers, the dignity of the court, the respect for the system, all of it had been called into question by one woman's refusal to accept her assigned place in the hierarchy. The aftermath of her bold action rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The officers who had struck her were forced to confront the reality of what they had done. Not just a physical act of violence, but the deeper violation of human dignity that had prompted such an extraordinary response. They found themselves in the impossible position of having to decide whether to compound their error with further violence or to acknowledge, through their inaction, that she had a right to the seat she had claimed. The legal implications were staggering and complex. What laws, if any, had been broken? What precedents existed for such a situation? How could the system respond to someone who had challenged it so fundamentally, while simultaneously embodying its highest ideals? The lawyers in the room found themselves in uncharted territory, without precedent to guide them or procedure to follow. But perhaps more importantly, the moral implications of the moment began to sink in for everyone present. This wasn't just a disruption of order. It was a restoration of it. The true order that says every human being deserves dignity, every person is worth. Every individual has a right to be treated with respect regardless of their position in society's hierarchy. News of what had happened began to spread beyond the courtroom walls, carried by those who had witnessed it and could barely believe what they had seen. In an age of instant communication, the story traveled with lightning speed, capturing the imagination of people who understood the profound symbolism of what had taken place. The public reaction was swift and intense. For some, she became an instant hero, a symbol of courage in the face of injustice, a reminder that power ultimately belongs to the people, a demonstration that dignity cannot be taken away by those who would abuse their authority. For others, her actions represented a dangerous challenge to the order that held society together, a precedent that could lead to chaos if others followed her example. But regardless of how people interpreted her actions, no one could deny their power. In a single moment, she had accomplished what years of legal challenges, protests, and political movements had struggled to achieve. She had forced a confrontation with the fundamental questions of justice, equality, and human dignity that lay at the heart of all social progress. The conversations that erupted in homes, offices, schools, and community centers across the country all circle around the same basic questions. Was she right to do what she did? What would you have done in her situation? What does her actions say about the state of justice in our society? And perhaps most importantly, what happens next? Her courage had created a moment of possibility, a crack in the seemingly impenetrable wall of institutional authority through which others might find the strength to assert their own dignity. The image of her sitting in that judge's chair became iconic, not just as a moment of individual defiance, but as a symbol of potential that exists within every person to claim their rightful place in the world. The legacy of her action extended far beyond the immediate consequences she faced. She had demonstrated something that many people had forgotten or never known, that ordinary individuals possess extraordinary power when they refuse to accept injustice. Her moment of courage became a source of inspiration for countless others who were facing their own struggles with systems and institutions that seemed designed to diminish their worth. Students studying the incident years later would debate its significance, its meaning, its place in the long arc of social progress. Was it a spontaneous act of courage or a calculated challenge to authority? Did it represent progress or chaos? What were its long-term effects on the justice system and society as a whole? But for those who were present in that courtroom, for those who witnessed the transformation of one woman from victim to symbol, the answers to these questions were clear. They had seen something rare and precious, a moment when the human spirit refused to be broken, when dignity asserted itself against all opposition, when justice was not handed down from on high, but claimed from below by someone who understood its true meaning. Her act of sitting in that judge's chair had revealed something profound about the nature of authority itself, that it derives its power not from positions people hold or the titles they carry, but from the respect and consent of those who are subject to it. When that respect is lost through abuse and that consent is withdrawn through injustice, authority becomes hollow, revealed as the fragile construct has always been. The ripple effect of her courage continued to spread long after she had left that courtroom. Other people facing injustice found strength in her example, drawing inspiration from her refusal to accept mistreatment. Organizations working for social change pointed to her story as evidence that individual actions could still make a difference in an age when many felt powerless against institutional forces. Educational institutions began including her story in curricula about civil rights, social justice, and the power of individual conscience. Her name was mentioned alongside other heroes who had stood up to injustice, who had refused to accept the status quo, who had demonstrated through their actions that change was possible when people were willing to risk everything for their principles. The woman herself, thrust into a spotlight she had never sought, handled her newfound notoriety with the same grace and dignity she had shown in that courtroom. She didn't claim to be a hero or a revolutionary. She simply said she had done what felt right in the moment, what her conscience had demanded, what her sense of self-worth had required. But her humility only made her more powerful as a symbol. She represented not the superhuman courage of legendary figures, but the everyday courage that exists within ordinary people when they are pushed too far, when they reach the point where dignity becomes more important than safety, when they decide that some lines cannot be crossed without consequences. The officers who had struck her were forced to confront the reality of what their actions had unleashed. What they had intended as a moment of control had become a moment of liberation. What they had meant as a demonstration of power had become a revelation of their powerlessness. What they had thought would restore order had instead exposed the deeper disorder that existed within the system they represented. Some of them, in the days and weeks that followed, began to question their own role in that system. Had they been servants of justice or enforcers of injustice? Had they been protecting society or protecting the privileges of those in power? Had their actions that day served the greater good or simply perpetuated the greater harm? These were uncomfortable questions, but they were necessary ones. Her courage had not only challenged the system, it had challenged everyone who participated in it to examine their own role, their own responsibility, their own complicity in perpetuating injustice, or their own potential for promoting change. The courtroom itself seemed changed by what had happened within its walls. The judge's bench, once a symbol of untouchable authority, now carried a memory of being occupied by someone who had claimed it not through appointment or election, but through moral right. The space felt different, charged with the possibility that authority could be questioned That power could be challenged. That justice could be claimed by those who have been denied it. Future proceedings in that courtroom would carry the echo of her presence, the reminder that the true source of judicial authority lay not in the robes or the gavel or the elevated seat, but in the consent of the governed and the commitment to treating all people with equal dignity and respect. As time passed and the immediate shock of the incident faded, the deeper significance of what she had done became even more apparent. She had demonstrated something that many had forgotten, that the power to change society lies not only with those who hold official positions, but with anyone who has the courage to stand up for what is right. Her legacy became a challenge to every person who encountered her story. What would you do when faced with injustice? Would you submit to authority even when that authority was wrong? Would you accept mistreatment to avoid confrontation? Or would you find the strength to claim your dignity, to assert your worth, to take your rightful place regardless of who tried to deny it to you? These questions resonated across communities and generations, sparking conversations about courage, justice, and the responsibility that each individual has to stand up against wrong wherever they encounter it. Her story became a touchstone for discussions about how change happens, how progress is made, how ordinary people can make extraordinary differences in the world. The image of her sitting in that judge's chair became more than just a moment captured in time. It became a symbol of possibility, a reminder that the most powerful positions in society are not beyond the reach of those who have been marginalized and oppressed. It suggested that true authority comes not from the privileges of birth or the accidents of circumstance, but from the strength of character and the commitment to justice. And so, as we reach the end of this remarkable story, we're left not with simple answers, but with profound questions. What does her courage mean for us today? How can we apply the lessons of her example to our own lives and our own struggles with injustice? What would we be willing to risk to claim our own dignity or defend the dignity of others? Her story reminds us that heroes are not born. They are made in moments of crisis when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. She didn't set out to become a symbol or to change the world. She simply refused to accept treatment that violated her fundamental human dignity. But in making that choice, she showed all of us what is possible when we refuse to accept less than we deserve. The courtroom where she sat may have returned to its normal routines, but the memory of her presence continues to inspire others to claim their own power, to assert their own dignity, to take their own stand against injustice. Her courage has become a gift to future generations, a reminder that change is always possible, that justice is always within reach, and that every person has the power to transform their world if they have the courage to claim it. So as you go about your day, as you face your own challenges and confront your own moments of injustice, remember her. Remember the woman who refused to stay down when power tried to strike her down. Remember the courage it took to walk toward that judge's seat instead of away from those who had wronged her. Remember the dignity with which she claimed her rightful place in a system that had tried to deny her worth. And ask yourself, what seat are you meant to occupy? What power are you meant to claim? What justice are you meant to demand? Because if her story teaches us anything, it's that the most important positions in life are not given. They are taken by those who have the courage to believe they deserve them. The gavel may have fallen silent in that courtroom, but the echo of her courage continues to ring out across time, challenging each of us to rise to our own moments of truth, to claim our own dignity, to take our own stand for justice. Her legacy is not just a memory of one extraordinary moment, but the ongoing invitation for each of us to create our own. What will you do with that invitation? How will you answer that challenge? The seat is waiting. The question is, do you have the courage to claim it?